All right, hi everyone. My name is Jonathan Lawson, and I work at Broad Institute. I'm a member of the AnVIL team, and I'm here to talk to you today about how the AnVIL can help you with data sharing, particularly with meeting the requirements of the NIH data management and sharing policy that has just come out earlier this year. So we'll talk a little bit about the policy at first, and then also about the different components of the AnVIL that will help you meet the policy requirements, both on sharing data, making sure it's publicly accessible and available, findable to future researchers who would need it, and then also where that data can actually be stored. And we'll have a little bit more emphasis on how to make it shareable, and then I'll talk a little bit less about exact storage, but we'll give you some ideas on what you could use in the AnVIL for that. So going in a little bit further, the NIH DMS policy, the data management and sharing policy, became effective in January 25th of 2023. Some key components of this policy and its requirements are that investigators are now required to submit a data management and sharing plan at proposal time that's reviewed as a part of the administrative review in the proposal process. And if the grant is awarded, becomes a term and condition of the award. So it's important to note that what you agree to in that plan is expected to be adhered to. It is potentially renegotiable between you and your program officer, but you would certainly want to be cautious not to put anything in the plan that you are not certain you could execute on, because it may come with certain contingencies that may delay funding or have other repercussions to you if you're not able to execute it. So keep that in mind today. That's what we're really trying to help you prepare for, is knowing what you can do in order to share data successfully according to your DMS plan. And also a key component of this that we'll talk about more specifically with sharing is, particularly for control data, the metadata that you share should make sure to take into account the consent forms and any data use limitations or restrictions on the data, making sure that that's managed appropriately. And we'll have a little bit of a nod toward that in some of the presentations, particularly as we talk about the DUOS product and how it helps with controlled data access. So just to be clear on the scope of the NIH DMS policy, it applies specifically to the scientific data that's generated under an award. So this would not necessarily be, all the emails or budgets or HR records that you use to administrate grant funding successfully, but really the scientific data that's generated that I think it's best said could potentially represent data and findings in a publication, but not necessarily is published upon. So that would be published and unpublished data are within the scope of the NIH DMS policy. And again, exactly what you share is agreed to within the details of your plan, but keep in mind that the policy does have both published and unpublished data that is scientific in nature in view. Another additional piece of guidance just to be aware of, there are various repositories and information that NIH has put forward on how exactly you can find a repository to store this data and make it shareable. Small data sets, of course, can be deposited in PubMed. There are also many institutions with their own repositories, even generalist repositories that are available. And again, guidance on all of these is available through NIH's sharing.gov website for more information. So we'll just point you to that if needed. And then to speak a little bit more to institutions in this case, and I think hopefully putting a few folks who might be anxious or feeling very unaware of what the DMS policy requires and how they and their institution will meet it. I want to note many researchers and signing officials currently are planning on depositing their data, as you can see it right, in third-party repositories external to their institution or in an NIH repository, whether it be the AnVIL or dbGaP or other repositories you're familiar with from NIH. And some are also intending to use their institution's repository as the place of sharing, so to meet the DMS requirements. But at the same time, as you can see at left, many institutions are also, while depositing externally, planning on keeping a copy of that data at their own institution. So just a nod that this means there's likely to be 2 copies of this data out there and potentially paid for by grant funding if you're not careful. And I think that's one benefit, particularly if you're an NHGRI funded researcher we'll talk about, is that the AnVIL can help resolve this need for double storage costs for you. Another key thing, again, just more to help put folks at ease, there really is also not consensus across these different institutions on exactly how they will make sure their investigators are being compliant with DMS. And so I think we want to help you understand that there's actually tools within the AnVIL that will help you do this for your own lab and even your institution, do this at an institutional level if necessary. So we're excited to be able to share that, some of those kind of easy to use and at times free to anyone features of the AnVIL that we're very excited about, not just for NHGRI funded investigators. So again, a lot of unclear practices in terms of exactly what institution-wide sharing looks like. And I think what we want to get to today is really helping folks who are in this, I don't know if or how we're going to make sure we're compliant with the DMS, or I'm certain we don't have an approach to this. Again, we just want to point you in some helpful directions today and show you how the AnVIL can help. And then as we think about the repositories that you want to use, and this will be true of AnVIL and true of many of the other NIH cloud platforms that are allowing storage for their investigators, is really, if you think about these different repository options, there's a specific benefit in returning data to an NIH repository that really puts the burden, and I think we're thankful NIH is willing to do this, it puts the burden of evaluating and managing long-term storage costs on the NIH. Also managing data access requests, which can have quite a long tail and potentially even an increasing one as data science becomes more and more common throughout the biomedical research community. Data access requests, even for data that's long ago released, may increase again. And then we could also just think about the general security and liability constraints of making, when your institution continues to manage access to data, that's a liability that they maintain that has a cost to it. And again, having NIH own that may be something that you and your institution find to be incredibly beneficial. And again, this option is really of returning back to NIH repository most helpful if you don't feel like you need a copy at your own institution. I think there's even, we won't necessarily talk about the full scope of this today, but there's even ways that NIH and specifically NHGRI is working to help researchers who deposit data in the AnVIL to use that as a copy of reference for themselves going forward, even once the AnVIL has ingested that and is owning the storage costs and the access management. So just a nod of thanks to NHGRI and the AnVIL folks who kind of worked on these policies. So let's talk a little bit more about the specific components of the AnVIL that can help you with the DMS. So the AnVIL is a very broad program, and we're thankful to have many folks from different institutions working on this. And really just want to call out today, we're going to talk primarily about DUOS, which you see at the bottom left, and then also about Terra, and specifically the data repository in Terra, which is where you would store data. So we'll dive a little bit more into that in a second. And just to clarify here, who can really use the AnVIL and who can use it for DMS, and how might you go about that? So first of all, NHGRI, if you are an NHGRI funded researcher, storage in the AnVIL is free. We have storage in place for funded NHGRI researchers. In the future, you're welcome to reach out to your program officer if you're unaware of this and to talk a bit more about exactly how that would work. But I think I can speak for the AnVIL team to say we're excited to be able to support you and look forward to that, to making your data available via the AnVIL. If you're funded by another NIH institute for a grant and are still interested in using the AnVIL, I think the first step, there's maybe a few options, but the first step is to have you speak with your program officer at that institute or center and have them reach out to a representative at NHGRI for the AnVIL to talk about how they might be able to have your data placed in the AnVIL. Done that in the past. There's certain processes that those ICs need to work out amongst themselves, and we're going to make that happen. But you're welcome to go to that website there on the screen to learn more. And then also, as I said, there's some features that are in these systems you can pay for, and even some that are free that I think will help folks, especially those who are willing to store data themselves, or just trying to make data available via open access or controlled access outside of an NIH data access committee. So we'll talk briefly about those in a second. But as I mentioned, just to point out, the Terra data repositories where data can be stored, it is relatively straightforward to bring your data into Terra. I would note it is the use of a cloud platform. So if you want to store your data on Azure or Google Cloud, that would be an option for you in Terra data repository. If you are not NHGRI funded, That means you would need to understand how long you are committing to pay those cloud costs yourself if you don't have some other agreement with your IC and NHGRI. So that is a constraint for those of you who are listening who may not be NHGRI funded or not able to work with your IC to work that out. But other than that, you're able to bring in data kind of simply in a drag and drop sort of storage way, put it in the Teradata repository, or you could define a schema. And I think the particularly interesting aspect of this is the AnVIL also has its own schema set that if you're able to map to, you would be able to expose your data in the same kind of fine-grained search that all of the other AnVIL data is searchable through and discoverable through. And then again, we're a couple of different pathways, and we do have some support for this to help you actually ingest your data into the Teradata repository. So it's just a brief note on the Teradata repository, which we affectionately call TDR. And then I'll turn my attention a little more to DUOS. So the Data Use Oversight System, or DUOS, is really a tool that you can think of as the place where you would share your data or submit your data to a data access committee, or to expose it and make it available in a catalog or library that a researcher may come in and find it, and if necessary, request access. So this is really meeting those requirements the DMS policy would have around making sure your data is publicly available or findable. It uses a persistent identifier, which DUOS issues. And again, if necessary, to manage those controlled access terms like data use conditions that we talked about in the past, DUOS would help you catalog those and also, again, manage those as a DAC, whether you are a DAC yourself or you're submitting to an NHGRI DAC or other NIH DAC that may use DUOS in the future. So to do that, really what you do, and we'll walk through DUOS quickly in a second to go through this, but you would go into DUOS and submit data through the study registration form, and then it would go over to the DAC that you had selected for them to review. And once they take ownership of it, it would become publicly available in the DUOS UI, or if open access, it would just be immediately available through the DUOS UI. A couple of points, I think I mentioned a few of these, so I'll just pass over these quickly. The short summary is you can manage controlled access data with the NHGRI DAC easily in DUOS. That's kind of the first class feature in the AnVIL. You can also manage controlled access data that you or some other DAC that's not necessarily using DUOS in DUOS. So you could put it there, and we would just then send information to you as researchers are interested in finding your data set. So it's a way really for solving using DUOS just to solve the findability piece, but not necessarily the accessibility piece if you want to continue to kind of own that. You are also welcome to bring your own DAC to DUOS. This is kind of outside of the standard features of the AnVIL and would have a cost. So it's not principally what the AnVIL is trying to do, but that is an option if necessary. And then also, as I said, if you have open access data sets that are stored, whether in AnVIL or elsewhere, DUOS is happy to register those for you for free and make them available in the library with persistent identifiers. So just ways we're trying to help out and make sure folks can meet DMS requirements. And I put these up here as kind of helpful thoughts as we kind of close out this portion before we jump over to looking at things in the UI. To say, a lot of folks are asking about costs, and I think we want to be clear about that. And trying to make as many things kind of free or supported by NHGRI as possible. So we're excited about that. I think a commendation for folks as you write your DMS plans is to think about whether or not data access management is going to be open versus controlled. And noting that a lot of times DMS plans are created before consent forms are created. So really you want to think about what you're committing to in your DMS plan and making sure you're letting your IRB know after you're given a notice of award what you had committed to, and making sure that those are well reconciled, that you're not saying data is going to be open access in your DMS plan, and then ultimately the IRB comes in with data sharing language in your consent form that restricts access under controlled access processes. And then also kind of a key one to think about, and a reason I think NHGRI has been so helpful in use of the AnVIL is the question of how long do you store the data is probably one of the trickier ones in light of the DMS policy, where thankfully NHGRI taking on storage for NHGRI funded researchers is very helpful. Something you therefore don't have to think so much about. But for other folks, again, you want to be cautious about what you commit to and make sure you've budgeted accordingly and are able to pay those storage costs that you have committed to in advance of your grant funding ending. So just a thing to keep in mind as we go forward. So I'll pause here in case there are questions, but if not, we'll go ahead and jump into the demo portion. All right. Hearing none, I'm going to jump over to DUOS. I think you all should still be able to see my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here. So this is DUOS, which is at duos.org. And there's a few key workflows. I think you might have been able to pick up on this, but just to call this out really clearly, in DUOS, really there's data registration or data submission, which we'll look at first. And in that process, as you'll see, once you submit the data set, you're typically submitting it to a data access committee. And then that data access committee is kind of publishing that data in our library, which makes it available, as you see at right, for data requesters to come in and request access to that data access committee. So we'll take a look both at data registration and at the data access request application, so you can know how you would be able to come into DUOS and to register new data sets, again, in light of DMS or for publication or funding requirements with the AnVIL, and then also how you might be able to submit a data access request for AnVIL data or other data in DUOS in this process. So as we jump in, we'll look first, as I said, at our data catalog. And so you can see here, we have a number of data sets. Right now, DUOS is managing a few Broad data sets also. But let's look at, first and foremost, the Gregor data sets that we have here. And we'll just pretend like we're going to request access to these now. You can see I select them, and then I click Apply for Access. And then I'm taken to our single data access request application page. Here, I'm asked a few basic questions first about who I am. As a researcher, I need to authenticate with ERA Commons, list myself or my principal investigator at this step, and then I'm able to add any staff in my lab or other collaborators in my institution, maybe at different labs that I'm working with. Also designating my signing official and my IT director, and a little bit more about other people I'm working with and exactly where we're doing our work. Then in the second section, we're really talking a bit more about exactly what the work is that we're doing. This should look similar to a dbGaP application where I've selected the data sets. I give my title of my project here, and then describe both in a more academic sense, the research that I propose to do, and then in a more generally readable, non-technical summary. We also do ask here, and this is part of what we do to leverage the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health's standards. We ask you to describe your research proposal in terms of the GA4GH data use ontology. That just helps our data access committees make a more clear decision on your request. So that's part of your research use statement that you describe it here. And then as we drop down into section 3, we're asking some basic kind of ethical check questions that data access committees use just to make sure there's no concerning activities, or if there are, to follow up and make sure that they're appropriate given the consent of the data. And then lastly, we have our data use agreements sections where you have both your attestation and then also your agreement to the Broad and NHGRI library card agreements, which are effectively data access agreements or data use certifications, as you might be familiar with, that are your attestations to appropriately handle and analyze the data. Once you complete this, your data access request would be sent over to the data access committee. And I think as an important asterisk, you would also need your signing official's approval once to begin use of DUOS in order to submit data access requests. So it's not visualized here, but the DUOS support team works with you to identify that signing official, get that approval, so that you're then able to submit DARs as you will without their review on each data access request. So that's how the data access request application works. If and when you're approved, you'll get an email from the DUOS system with the dataset approvals for the dataset IDs of all the datasets you're approved for. And then you'll be able to go and find those. Again, if they're in the AnVIL, you would be granted access immediately and then able to export those to workspaces in the AnVIL and start analysis. So that's a quick rundown of how do I get access to the AnVIL data. If we go back to our data catalog, let's also talk about maybe I had done some research and generated data under an award. How do I actually share that data? So quite simply, from the same page, I would just click Add Dataset, and I'm taken to our study registration form here, where I can start to fill out basic information about the work I completed, likely describing what we had done under this award and who was involved in it, and any other information I need. Also, there's some basic funding questions around whether or not this data is also already registered in dbGaP or not, and who at NIH you've been working with for this project, again, if you're NIH funded. And then lastly, in this section, this is where you're able to delineate different data sets, whether those are based on consent, having differently consented populations in your research, or if you have different versions, you're able to spell those out and add multiple groups down here, as you can see. But this is where you would come in, give a name to each data set, describe its different data use terms. These would be akin to the NIH data use limitations, assign the data set to a specific data access committee in DUOS, or if open access, you would not need to assign a data access committee. And then if you're able to tell us where the data is located, how many participants, and then if you do have an NIH institutional certification, you're able to upload that here. So once I had completed this, again, I could add many data sets if needed for different consent groups or versions. I'm able to then submit this, and this would go over to the data access committee or committees I had identified as ones to manage this data set. And after they'd accept, the data would again be available in the DUOS data catalog here for access requests for subsequent researchers. So that's a quick overview of DUOS and exactly how we would go through both register data sets and submit access requests for data sets in DUOS. I hope this has been helpful in being very clear on how you can use DUOS to both share your data and gain access to other researchers' data that they have shared. And I'll pause here for questions, and happy to go back to any points of the presentation or the demo to dive deeper if needed.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.